Adesso passiamo al prossimo relatore, Dr. Julian Hume, dal Natural History Museum di Londra. La relazione ovviamente in inglese. Thank you, Julian.
Hello. Is it on? Yeah. Buongiorno. I'd first like to thank Anna and Giorgio for inviting me today to your beautiful city and also this wonderful setting of the Natural History Museum. It's absolutely fantastic, so very nice. And the weather has been wonderful as well. What a start. Well, I'd like to talk to you about a famous group of islands, particularly Mauritius, where the Dodo, a famous extinct bird, came from. But all the information seems to be stuck on that one bird. What else has actually been lost from those islands as a result of human action? So I'd just like to give you an insight into what really was going on. Well, got a pointer on here. There we are. The Mascarene Islands are just here. And Réunion, Mauritius and Rodrigues, they're volcanic in origin and never been connected to each other and so have evolved in isolation. So spectacular evolutionary events have taken place, particularly with birds, reptiles and bats. No terrestrial mammals ever got there. They were too remote. Well, Mauritius is a volcanic island, as I said, and it has these spectacular peaks. This is the remains of the original volcano that have eroded away. So you've got the caldera, the flat centre with these peaks, very mountainous, but also surrounded by a large lagoon, which gives an idea of its age, which is between 8 and 10 million years old. And this is one of the islets within the lagoon, and actually these have been saviours for some of the animals because they've managed to survive on here when they've become extinct on the mainland. Réunion Island is the youngest of the Mascarene group. It's still volcanically active. It's still blasting away and growing on this side here, incredibly high, but it also receives some of the highest rainfall in the world. So it's in spectacular gorges have formed due to erosion from rain. And it has this incredibly well-preserved mountain forest, but unfortunately, the lowlands have been completely cleared by humans, and so it's suffered some of the highest extinction rates of the island group. Lastly, little Rodrigues. This is the smallest of the islands. It's about the same age as Mauritius, maybe a little bit older, and really it's like a hill in a sea. It's very, no real high mountain peaks, and just like Mauritius, surrounded by a large lagoon, which has these islets, but because they were quite close to the shore, they didn't act as reservoirs for the animals to survive. So animals that have last recorded on these islands have now disappeared, so it's been a very complete extinction event there. Well, the Mascarenes are actually the last island group discovered, large island group discovered by Europeans. It wasn't until the Arabs were aware of them in the 14th century. This is an Arab map, and there's Madagascar. We just heard about Madagascar, and this is the Mascarenes here. But the Arabs never settled on the islands, and the Portuguese followed, and again, they never settled. But this is a map from Cantino in 1504. The Portuguese actually arrived in 1507, but stole Arab maps to get an idea of what was going on. You can recognise Africa, there's Madagascar, and there's our Mascarene group there, a little bit close up as well. But they never settled either. So it wasn't until the arrival of the Dutch on September the 1st, 1598, that the documented history and the settlement of the islands began. And the Dutch were really great because they started recording what they saw immediately. So this is a publication from 1600. They arrived in 1598, returned 1599, and this is the first time the dodo was ever illustrated in a book. And this is Dutch activities on shore. Well, as time went on, of course, the islands were exploited. And just to give you an inkling what was to come, they didn't even have to shoot animals. They could literally run after them here. You see them chasing parrots and catching them, not using guns. And exaggeration was already coming in because this is supposed to be an upturned shell of a giant tortoise with 10 men sat in it. A bit of exaggeration, but tortoises were there in huge abundance, and it's a very nice image, quite a tragic one, of what was happening on the islands. Well, on all islands around the world, and I've been to many, there's always 3 phases that we do when we arrive on an island, generally, and putting it in a broad context. The first is overhunting. So when we arrive on an island, there's large animals on Mauritius, there are dodos, easy to catch, overhunt. The second invasion is introduced animals, because once we've overhunted, we bring in our own food. And it was quite important in the early days of shipping, because they would introduce goats and pigs especially onto islands and release them so that they would breed up in numbers for the next ship that came in. So introduced animals were particularly bad, and they would breed up and overrun the islands. The worst culprit, of course, was the black rat, an unwanted visitor, which would not only have maybe affected birds, eggs, chicks, but also was a competitor for the very limited resources on the island. The final thing we do is habitat destruction, and we've seen that in Madagascar now, and this is a period this is the French period, where inroads were made into the forest. The British took over in 1810 of Mauritius, introduced sugarcane and expanded it, and this was up to 97. 2017, there's less than 1% of the original forest left on Mauritius. Well, incidentally, I'll throw in a few of my paintings as I go through my talk, just in case you're not really understanding too much what I'm saying. You should get a pretty picture to look at. So this is just summing up the extinction of the animals. Dodo here, humans, deforestation, fires were used to burn off the forest, rats arrived, and so on. In a very short time, the animals became extinct. And really, the paradise was lost on all three islands. By the end of the 17th century, the islands were basically unrecognised. And this was taken in, I took this photograph in 2000, looking south through Mauritius. This is the second highest mountain, and this is the extent of sugarcane. Sugarcane is now declined in the Mascarenes, and so if you go there today, this is all development. There's no longer cane fields. Well, how do we know what was lost from those islands? Well, I'm a paleontologist. I work on fossils. So this is myself working on Rodrigues Island in a cave, excavating a giant tortoise bone. It's really a number of criteria we've been used to work out what was there. And of course, I'm biased towards the fossil record. But the fossil record never really began on the Mascarenes until 1865, where George Clark was a school teacher, very interested in fossils, was inquiring about anyone who should find anything, let him know. And just by luck, a British railway engineer was working on a site called the Mauritius, which is here. It's a very dull-looking place, full of mosquitoes, introduced forest around it. But he saw labourers stockpiling bones as they were digging the marsh. So he took some samples to Clark, and the first fossils were found on Mauritius. And this is just some of the material. There's at least 20,000 bones have come out of the site in those 1860 excavations. This is all Dodo, but lots of other nice things as well. And it all went quiet a bit until the 1890s, when a hairdresser, Etienne Thiriou, in his part-time was going up into the mountains. This is Snail Rock. The capital's down here, Port Louis. This is up in the mountains. And he found incredible specimens in small caves and in undercuts, and including this one, which is the most complete dodo known, almost absolutely complete with every bone there to see. Well, again, it went quiet on Mauritius until I was involved in an excavation on the Mauritius back from 2006 to 2010. We couldn't overcome the water problem, so we had to use a big machine with scoops to bring the stuff to the surface. And just to give you an idea what we found, this is all giant tortoise here. And we look at close up at it, Dodo, and it's in a matrix of seeds, fungi, insects, everything. So, and it's 4,500 years old. We could actually have a window into the world 4.5 years ago on Mauritius, looking at everything from insects upwards. And it started giving us some great ideas of what actually happened and what was lost since that time. Well, last year we found another locality up in the north, and this time called the Marla Show, in the middle of a sugarcane field. But again, wonderful material. That's me there overseeing the excavation. We've just done these pits. And on the surface, dodos, giant tortoise, and so on again. And so when we put all these together, this was a 14,500-year-old site, which makes it the oldest site outside of Madagascar and Aldabra. Again, we found dodos. And you can start seeing the damage that humans have done over time when we look at these two sites and start doing some comparisons. Well, it wasn't just Mauritius that had a good fossil record. Reunion Island, the Hermitage Marsh, proved to be a really wonderful site. Unfortunately, it's now been developed. It's now gone, but a huge number of bones were found on this site, including flightless birds and so on. So we've got a good idea about Reunion. And then finally, Rodrigues. Rodrigues has got no marsh sites, but it's full of caves. And they're particularly nasty because it's limestone, is very sharp and jagged, and if anyone has a chance to go in a limestone cave, just don't wear anything decent because it just shreds your clothes. And that's me crawling into Cavern Port Rouge. And it was worth it though, because right at the end of the cavern, crawling away, was this incredible bird. It's the closest relative of the dodo, now extinct. And give you an idea, there's its skull and its beak's here, the neck and the legs are down here. So it's laying on its side, got to the bottom of this cave and died. And just to give you an idea of what the actual bird was, that's my reconstruction of it, the solitaire from Rodrigues. Very spectacular bird indeed. Well, fossil record, wonderful, but because the islands were so recently discovered, there's also wonderful documents from the very first times people on the islands when the fauna was still pretty much around. Some are written documents. This was on the Gelderland fleet in 1601 of a dodo. It's the only dodo drawn on Mauritian soil, just freshly killed. It was just sort of laid. This is not part of it. Its body goes through here. What a wonderful illustration indeed. Well, there are skin remains, and this is the most famous of the dodo skin remains. It's the one in Oxford, and this is the only surviving soft tissue, only surviving skin of a dodo anywhere. But there's also wonderful paintings, and this was from India, the menagerie in India, Surat, by an artist called Mansa, and this is probably the most accurate dodo drawing you're ever going to see anywhere. These are all quite accurate drawings of other birds. This is your dodo right in the centre. And there are other nice illustrations as well. This one is a skin of the now extinct Mauritius blue pigeon. It's a group of pigeons from the island. The skin is it's a very old skin. A lot of the feathers are now gone. But a live one came to Amsterdam in 1790, lived for about 3 months, and it was displaying. So an artist drew the bird or painted it in display. So we would never have known that had it not been for this painting. Beautiful stuff. And there are other skins. This is Reunion. It was a terrestrial starling. You've got introduced starlings in here, but this terrestrial one, and there's a skin of it as well. So there's lots of information there. And also, we've actually got photographs, and photographs are becoming more and more important with extinct animals because more and more are becoming extinct that were photographed alive. And this is the Round Island boa. This was photographed in 1969, this one in 1975, and it's probably the same individual, never been seen again. It's now extinct. So when you look at what was there and add all those things up, it's a really high percentage that's been lost from those 3 islands already. But are we getting the true numbers of extinctions by what we have just seen, unless we go into more detail? So the idea was that I started looking at the vertebrates and seeing how many more species may have become extinct over time. Well, this is 2 I've just mentioned, of course, the famous dodo. This is solitaire, painting of mine of 2 fighting because they were very aggressive. But when I started looking at the other groups, things started falling in place. For example, with the turtle doves, there's the pink pigeon. You may or may not have heard of the pink pigeon, which still survives on Mauritius. And but there was one on Reunion which is known, this one from Rodrigues, and it was very odd that was not one from Mauritius. So when I started looking in the fossil record, lo and behold, I found one. So I described a new one, but extinct from Mauritius. And the same, I just mentioned the blue pigeons, the same with those. There was 2, this one described from Reunion, this one from Mauritius. Why was there not one on Rodrigues? Found some bones, described it, there's one from Mauritius. So what we're getting a pattern here is that each of these groups of birds occupied each island, and if they weren't on one or the other, then potentially it's purely because there was no record left of them unless we find bone material. Rails, sorry, this is just an example. There were 5 species recorded. This is a coot, this is one from Rodrigues. And this one here was described from Reunion, and again, I thought they may be the same genus on Reunion, and there again found it on Mauritius. Same with some smaller birds, passerines, much more difficult to look at in the fossil record because they generally don't preserve very well. This is baubles, one from Reunion. These still survive, fortunately, and I found a fossil one from Rodrigues. Also with the starlings, one from Reunion, one from Rodrigues, and this is my illustration of them here, and I found one from Mauritius. And then finally, the little weaver birds, again, one missing from this island, and then we found evidence for it as well. So it's filling in the gaps and just showing how much extinction we weren't aware of over time. And parrots, the islands were just full of parrots, and they have all been described, but this was a comparatively recent illustration by the same artist who drew that dodo of this beautiful big extinct parrot from Mauritius, Lophocydicus mauritianus, and it was one of the world's largest, and it's very poorly known. It's known from a few bones and virtually no descriptions. And I'm just going to give you a quick example of how am I right in terms of reconstructing. You see my paintings, am I right or am I wrong? Well, let's have a quick look at this one. It was thought for some reason that the parrot was blue. So these two beautiful illustrations, 1907 Rothschild, Hatchiska 1953, for some reason thought they were all blue. And there's no evidence for that at all. So I came in, and I looked at the evidence, and there was one description said that they were like ravens with blue heads. So I thought, well, maybe they were dark colour like a raven and had a blue head. So that's my reconstruction of the parrot. And then in 2015, a colleague of mine found a beautiful piece of information describing these parrots in the wild, and I was all wrong, so was everyone else, because they were actually, the blue head was right, but they were actually red into purple on the body. So I was actually wrong in my reconstruction. But it's like evolution. All the time, you get more information, you can change as you go along. Well, just to finish, what can all of this information together tell us about the island of Mauritius and the other islands of the Mascarenes before humans arrived? What was the extent of our effects on these places? Well, first off, the islands were covered in giant tortoises, the most dense populations anywhere on Earth, more so than the Galapagos and Aldabra, where they still survive today. This is an incredible specimen, the only known stuffed one that came from Rodrigues. And again, my illustration of the density of numbers on the island. And also, there were giant skinks. These were terrestrial. This one in particular was one of the world's largest. It was about this big. And it was a terrestrial one that fed on fruits. So when you start looking at all this information, more importantly, pollen from the fossil record, you can start working out the actual species of plant. Well, so the Mauritius would have looked something like this 4,500 years ago with all these different types of trees and plants. And there were natural fires as well that burnt through and changed the composition of the forest. So humans arriving, setting fire to places is not always an unnatural thing. But I think the most important discovery made, because we're now dealing with insects, and now we're really talking about a mass extinction event. Just in one small sample, we found 8 species of bird and tortoise dung specialist beetles that are now totally extinct. So you lose the tortoise, you lose the tortoises, you lose the dodo. The knock-on effect is a huge number of insects disappear. And the only reason we know about these is because they have these hard wing cases. All those soft-bodied insects, which have been hundreds and hundreds, we have no idea at all of what they were, numbers of species. And again, a painting of mine just showing a few that we do have in the fossil record. There are some extinct butterflies, snails. Here's our little dung beetle, carnivorous beetles. We really are only scratching the surface. Probably thousands of insects have become extinct we never know anything about. Well, I don't want to finish on a gloomy note. I always think of what we can do to try and prevent extinction and turn the story around. In 1982, there were just 12 echo parakeets left. They were considered doomed, and a huge amount of effort went in. So in 2019, 750. It's now been downgraded from critically endangered to endangered, and they're doing very, very well. Pink pigeon I mentioned, there were just 10 in 1991. They're now up to 500 birds, but there was a genetic bottleneck where there were so few birds from the founding population, they're having all sorts of problems with disease. A real shame. And even how did this survive? The Mauritian kestrel was down to 4 individuals, 1 female, and they managed to bring it back. They got it up to 400 individuals, but that genetic bottleneck problem has come back to haunt it, and it's now on a steep decline again, which is a real shame. It's down to about 150, 200 birds in the last 2 years. It's just incredible how it's suddenly collapsed. And there are other songbirds in peril. These are some of the passerines who are suffering from habitat destruction and diseases, introduced diseases and so on. But what can be done to save those? Well, all of those birds I've just mentioned, it's a huge amount of financial and labour costs to keep them alive. If they take away humans from those islands, those birds will just go very quickly. They're controlling cats, they're controlling rats, they're stopping weeds coming into the forests. Every year they have to trap, clear. And if they came out, they'd all go very quickly. So it's a huge expense to keep them going. But on Rodrigues Island, they did a very, very clever thing. They brought back giant tortoises from Aldabra because they were such an important animal on the island for controlling weed growth and so on. And these are natural weed controllers. They like to eat introduced invasive plants because the native plants had defences against tortoises. So they found it very hard to actually eat the native plants, and they started clearing all these weedy areas, and this is all native plant growth coming back. It's just incredible. And the government then encouraged people to plant native trees in their gardens, fields, anywhere, just start planting native trees. So it started making corridors again across the island, so little pockets of forest could be reached by various animals. And there's not many surviving animals on Rodrigues, unfortunately, but there are these two songbirds. And what was remarkable was that just like the other birds I talked about, pink pigeon and so on, this one was down to about 25 birds, and this one to about 30 in the 1970s, because of that new effort of planting, encouragement, doing it just for an interest to help preserve the island. Numbers now 5,000, and this one about 7,000, and they're both spread all over the island. It's just a wonderful return on very little cost, so it can be done. And I'd just like to finish with a painting of mine. This is the Mauritius, 4,500 years ago. Everything you see on this painting, bar 1 or 2 species, are now gone. And this is so we can recreate it quite accurately. And so finally, we're starting to do something on these islands to change the trend, to stop that disappearance. So the tortoises are back, but unfortunately, something like the dodo, there's nothing left like it on Earth. That's gone forever, but it's always a price to pay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. Interessantissimo, avete visto non solo il suo lavoro di paleo-ornitologo, ma anche di paleo-artista, veramente multitalenti. Se ci sono domande abbiamo tempo, quindi li prendiamo. Aspetta che prendiamo. Così si sente anche in streaming.
Thank you for your presentation. Do you have any evidence about the tourism impact on wildlife now in the island?
Indeed. Oh, yeah. Okay. I can use this one? Okay. Hello. Okay. Good. Yep. Okay. You would imagine those islands, the famous tourist island, Mauritius and so on, so there would be quite a lot of impact from tourists, but there's not, because the sugarcane was the key to the islands, and the habitat was already destroyed, so it was pockets of tourism around the coast, the usual thing, nice coast, hotels and so on. So tourism didn't really have an impact, but until recently, where now, because the sugarcane has gone, they're now looking for ways to bring more tourists in. So some of those islets, which I talked about, protected animals in the lagoons, they're starting to put hotels on them. And it's only going to be a matter of time before things like rats get onto those islands. Then they've got surviving populations of reptiles, seabirds. It's all over again. That's the problem at the moment. So It's kind of a problem where one thing has disappeared in terms of the island's finance, working on another, and then new problems are going to come in. Quite remarkable.
And on this, how is biosecurity awareness going in the island?
Right. For the protected reserves, there's an island called Round Island, and it's really intense security. You're not allowed to go on there. You have to be quarantined. There's anything that's taken on the island is checked for no rats, no shrews. There's other animals that are introduced. It's the ones that aren't the nature reserves. Then the government is very lax, and they started taking infrastructure over without checking. And so far, rats and things haven't got to them, but it's only a matter of time. They're going to get an outbreak.
Yeah. Yes, because of course you said with little effort you can say, but eradication is a very expensive business.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, and very difficult. So
it's very difficult. That a huge amount of finance to protect those animals, and the problem is if we go, they go. That's the situation.
Thank you. Altre domande? Qua, Maurizio. Grazie. Down here.
Mi alzo. Hi. I'm an artist and I'm doing a project called Dodo Resurrection.
I know something about that.
It's absurd. The concept for science, you know, like resurrection is an absurd idea. This project is part of a project called Splendor, the splendor of the sun. So talking about the sun and how it is changing the sun from the Renaissance sun to sun now, that is very problematic, and the extinction is inside all these excursus. And okay, it's very absurd, and artists work with these things. But do you have, as I admired your painting and your coming from underground, these fragments of reality, and then creating a totality of reality is very beautiful. Do you have some imagination, like if one day we resurrect the dodo? It's my thing, to imagine this thing. But if you have, I would like to listen.
It's one of the most common questions I get asked. Will the dodo ever come back? Can we bring it back? And it's a fantastic thing. Not in my lifetime, unfortunately, which is a great shame. It's so complex. Jurassic Park, Spielberg, gave this impression that we can just walk up and get some blood and then bring back a dinosaur. And it's almost become ingrained now that we can do that. It's so complex. There's so many missing pieces. And even with recently extinct animals, where we have blood samples and lots and lots of material, they still can't actually piece it together. And what they're trying to do is they're going to have almost like a hybrid swarm, where they select probably the best animals that look like the parent, and then produce something that's been extinct. But as for the dodo, there's just not enough information there. We can't get anything from the bones. There's that skin, but that's been used, arsenic and everything else to preserve it. It's very, very difficult. So maybe in 50 years' time or something, they may be able to do something, but sadly not when I'm around, because I'd love to see one alive, I'm sure.
Grazie della domanda, perché ovviamente senza la rappresentazione artistica potremmo solo immaginare quel dodo da quello scheletro, ma ovviamente l'arte quando si tratta di animali estinti è fondamentale per la nostra immaginazione. Altre domande?
Hello. I noticed that usually dodos are depicted as fat and slow-moving animals. Is that true, or due to the fact that most of the information come from animals kept in captivity?
Very good question. The idea came from right in the early days that they were easy to catch. So it be thought then that because they're easy to catch, they're slow-moving, and then it started getting exaggerations. Each artist wanted to have a bigger, fatter dodo, and so some of those pictures came through. The bird just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and so it's totally not true, because my study of the history of the written documents, there's some very important information there. For example, there was a Dutch group, they said you can catch one, but not if it runs amongst the rocks. It's too quick. So if you can get it in the open, three or four people can actually chase it and catch it. Amongst the rocks, it was like this. So it certainly wasn't slow moving. It was very, very specialised, but it was certainly able to run around its island home with very efficient ways. And there's a study going on, we're looking at the ratio of bones to actually recreate how it walked, because it had quite a peculiar, it was a pigeon, and it seems, if you look at pigeons walking, their heads do this, but apparently the dodo had some sort of weird, more of a sort of a weird walk and was quite upright. So that's going to be a very interesting study. But it was quite an active, very active bird. Only downfall for it, it didn't fear humans, so it would never have run away. It wouldn't have recognised a human. So they could just walk up and knock it on the head, and there's your dodo. Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Qualcun altro? E poi passiamo al prossimo relatore, poi appunto abbiamo tempo ancora per domande se vi vengono in mente dopo. Tenetele per dopo. We're going to move to the next person, then we get a question afterwards. Thank you, Julian. Ringraziamo per la bellissima presentazione.